Welcome to Stories from the Village of Nothing Much. Like easy listening, but for fiction. I'm Kathryn Nicolai. I write and read all the stories you'll hear on the Village of Nothing Much. Audio engineering and sound design is by Bob Wittersheim. Now, if I know you, I bet you're ready to get cozy. Wait, extra cozy? We've got something for that. It's our own limited edition weighted pillow from Nothing Much Happens and Quiet Mind. I picked out the color myself, y'all. I often lay with mine on my chest before bed. It's like holding a baby or a sleeping cat. That weight just soothes me, and I wanted to share it with you. The first 100 orders will also get 2 months of our Premium Plus for free. Happy holidays. Order now through the link in our bio. Hello, my dears. You know when you're driving down the road in the evening, the sun has set and lights are coming on inside houses. And as you drive, you just look over and see folks moving around their kitchens or sitting under a reading lamp in their living rooms. And you just have that gentle curiosity about what's for dinner or what are they reading. If you do know that feeling, if you have had that thought, then this is the podcast for you. I've always loved the bits of books that are just about regular life. How things are made, or sensory experiences. I started writing stories for myself in this vein, and when I shared them on my bedtime story podcast, Nothing Much Happens, I heard from so many folks who said they enjoyed the same thing. So on this show, we served them up with a soundscape and a less soporific style, and if you stick around after the stories, I'll share some behind-the-scenes details and village tea. And now, because why not? Let's take a deep inhale through the nose and sigh from your mouth. Again, breathe in and out. Good. Our stories today celebrate Thanksgiving in 3 different ways. We'll start with Friendsgiving, rewriting the rules of tradition and sharing food with a table full of friends as the sweet potato pies cool in the pantry. Then we'll pack the car and head out, in over the river and through the woods. Cousins and dogs, a farmhouse kitchen with a dear aunt waiting to welcome you. Finally, we'll bundle up and walk into town to enjoy a perfect morning of floats and marching bands in At the Parade. Friendsgiving. We'd come up with the idea over the fence in my backyard, back at the beginning of fall when I was taking down the tomato cages in my garden, and my neighbor was raking the first of the fallen leaves in his yard. He'd called out to me that he'd made a soup with the last of my tomatoes and basil the night before. I'd brought them over in a bushel basket and left them on his doorstep, hoping he could make good use of them before they went bad. He told me he'd roasted them in the oven until they were blistered and just a bit charred, then blended them with broth and sprinkled the top with plenty of freshly ground black pepper and ribbons of basil. I dropped my cages by the edge of the garden and plucked off my gloves as I strode over toward the fence. I propped my elbows on its top rail to listen. "Tell me more," I said, making him laugh. We were old friends, having both grown up right here, each of us taking over our family homes when it was time. And one of our shared passions was food. We passed recipes back and forth, traded cookbooks, and ate from each other's gardens so much we eventually had a gate installed between our yards. I'd hear him unlatching it in the morning, a coffee cup in one hand as he picked a few cucumbers to go in a salad for lunch. I'd cross into his yard in the evenings and fill a colander with the raspberries that grew all along one side of the yard to make into jam for my morning toast. As he told me more about his tomato soup and the croutons he'd made with a day-old loaf of bread, it made me think about the bread I used to make stuffing for Thanksgiving dinner. The cafe downtown sold bags of bread ends, the cut-off bits that were too small or rounded to make a sandwich out of, and I would buy a bag or two and cut them up into cubes and let them dry on the baking sheet or toast them in the oven. I must have gone quiet in my Thanksgiving musings, and my friend noticed. He propped his arm on his rake handle and cocked his head to one side to ask what was on my mind. "Thanksgiving is going to be different this year," I said. He nodded slowly. Things change. Even the traditions we expect to go on forever can be interrupted. And I'd been mentally stumbling over the idea of the end of November for a while now. Not sure what it would look like or how I would feel. He leaned his rake against the trunk of a crabapple tree that took up most of the back corner of the lot. Crabapples are excellent trees for climbing. They have long, low branches that run nearly level with the ground, and we'd climbed this one 100 times as a kid. He shook out a lawn bag and said, "Let's host together this year. We'll find a few friends without plans, and we'll have a little Friendsgiving. What do you think?" The sun came out as we'd been talking, and I shielded my eyes with one hand and smiled wide at him. Perfect. Why didn't we think of it before? He started catching up big handfuls of leaves and dropping them into the bag. And as long as we're changing things up, let's try some new recipes. We can make a couple new traditions. I pulled my garden gloves back on and propped my hands on my hips. I've got a dozen recipes that I've been waiting to find a reason to make. I'll let you know what I come up with. I'd gone back to wrangling the tomato cages, and when the garden was put to bed, I'd waved over the fence and gone in to make a list. We spent the next couple of weeks exchanging cookbooks and torn out pages from magazines over the fence, calling up a few friends who we thought might be in the market for a different sort of holiday, and dividing up the chores. We'd have the meal at his place. He had an ancient dining room table with leaves that could double its length if needed. There would only be 5 or 6 of us, but we'd planned so many different dishes we needed the serving space. On Thanksgiving morning, we had one last council of chefs over the gate in the backyard. Each of us a tall cup of coffee in our hands, and the steam matching our breath in the cold morning air. I'd wanted to serve the meal on my grandmother's china, and had been washing and carefully stacking the plates into a deep box to bring over in time to set the table. He'd been watching videos about how to fold napkins in various fancy ways, and still hadn't picked a style. I'd bought candles for the table, and he'd made a playlist for pre-dinner, dinner, and dessert. We laughed as we sipped our coffee, realizing that we might have overthought the details a bit, but we were having fun, and that was the point. We clinked cups and headed back into our respective kitchens to get on with it. Now, it was a point of contention between us as to when Thanksgiving dinner should be served. In my household, it had always been truly a dinner and came around 5 p.m. just as the sun was setting. In his family, everyone had been seated at the table no later than 1 in the afternoon. We'd split the difference and asked our friends to show up around 3. That way we had plenty of time to cook, and everyone would have plenty of time to digest before bed. At 2:30, I was setting out the china. The silverware drawer had been full of mismatched forks, spoons, and knives, but they seemed just about right for the day, so I carefully laid them out, lining up their stems like a butler in an English country house. The music was going and the candles were lit. I had a focaccia in the oven that I'd made by hand, pressing divots into the soft dough with my fingertips where it caught olive oil, and grains of sea salt and strips of sage I'd grown myself. I wanted our friends to smell it the moment they opened the door, because there is no scent quite as welcoming as fresh baked bread. Soon the first knock came. A friend, a bottle of wine, another friend, a homemade pie, another knock, 2 more for dinner, and a casserole dish wrapped in kitchen towel to hold in the heat. We'd all gotten a bit spiffed up, and we toasted each other on having a very grown-up Thanksgiving. Along with the mismatched silverware, we'd leaned into the idea that the meal didn't need to look like most other Thanksgivings. There was the focaccia, and to go with it, I'd made mushroom and wild rice soup, thickened with a roux and seasoned with lots of fresh thyme. He'd made sheet trays of something we were calling Thanksgiving nachos, for which he'd made homemade refried beans from a recipe that had taken nearly 24 hours to complete. I'd made smashed rather than mashed potatoes by parboiling a lot of smallish Yukon Golds, then laying them out in the roasting pan and smashing them down with the underside of a drinking glass, splashing olive oil and seasoning all over and sliding them into the oven. We made Lebanese garlic sauce, whipped in the food processor, to go with them. There was a plate of tiny fried cakes we'd made from diced peppers and hearts of palm and breadcrumbs and Old Bay seasoning. And there was a huge salad with dark green leaf lettuce and toasted pine nuts and marinated red onion and the simplest and best vinaigrette that was just a couple of ingredients shaken together in a mason jar. After much testing, I'd finally, and controversially, converted completely from pumpkin pie to sweet potato pie, and 2 were cooling on a shelf in the pantry. Sitting at the table, passing plates and refilling glasses, I was so happy to be where I was. It was different. Those long-held traditions had seemed like pillars holding up the year. And if they changed, if they didn't happen just as they always had, it felt like perhaps the whole year would come crashing down. But I could see now that wasn't how it worked. The things that held me, that held my days in place, had to do with how I showed up for myself, for others, what I paid attention to. In a very simple sense, our days and our lives are what we pay attention to. And tonight my attention was woven into a bone-deep feeling of gratitude for friends and good food. The light was fading outside as I walked back to the pantry to bring out the pies. I stopped for a moment with one balanced in each hand and looked out through the kitchen window, across one yard, over the gate, and into my own, with the sky marked bright orange from the setting sun. Friends become more important as you grow older. Maybe because once you're not a kid anymore, you don't need friends in the way you did growing up. As an adult, a real friendship is probably the purest relationship a person can have. It exists solely because you care about each other, because you want good things for each other. As I listened to them talking and laughing across the table, I thought of that line of Oscar Wilde's, who, having friends, is poor. I turned from the window, ready to bring out dessert. I had everything I needed. Over the river and through the woods. It was the day before Thanksgiving, and the dogs and I stepped out into the morning air to find a thick frost on the ground and the sweet, stinging scent of coming snow in the air. The dogs chased and crunched through the leaves, leaving behind prints of their warm paws in the white frost. I stood with a quilt I'd pulled from the sofa and hastily wrapped around myself and watched my breath crystallizing in the air. Though it was cold, the sun was coming up, and I turned my face toward it, closing my eyes against the brightness and watching the shifting colors through my eyelids. I kept my eyes closed and listened. I could hear the dogs in their play, the very slight sound of wind in the empty branches, and the hopping and rustling of birds out for their morning meal. I whistled for the dogs and held the kitchen door open. They raced through with a buzz of canine excitement, and I was excited too. Today we were packing up the car and driving out, over the river and through the woods, for Thanksgiving on the family farm. I had grocery sacks ready at the door, full of all the good things that would make our meal. There were butternut squashes to be blended into a rich soup, bright red cranberries that we'd stew into a sauce with Honeycrisp apples and walnuts. There were jars of pickles that I'd canned myself, ready to be laid out on trays alongside crackers and warm toasted nuts. I had bundles of thyme and rosemary, and wide stippled leaves of sage. From the bakery I'd bought heaps of dinner rolls and pecan pies, all tied into white boxes with string, along with a few loaves of day-old bread, which I'd let dry out on the counter for stuffing. I had mushrooms that smelled of the forest floor to be made into a thick gravy, and of course, pounds and pounds of potatoes. We laughed at all the food as we packed it up, knowing that every other member of the family was likely to come with just as much, and my poor aunt, the current caretaker of the old white clapboard farmhouse, would have to get very creative when it came to storing, cooking, and serving it all. The sacks of groceries went into the car, and we wedged in our bags and tucked the dogs into the back seat. We made ourselves cups of hot tea and coffee to keep us company on the long drive, fiddled with the radio till we found a station of songs we could sing along to, and backed the car out onto the road. It was a few hours out to the farm, but the way was lovely. Soft, sloping hills, stands of beech trees and fields, tilled over after the harvest, and sometimes dotted in the distance with parcels of deer as they bent their necks to find lost ears of corn and leftover shafts of wheat. There were a few geese and ducks still floating on the river, postponing their flight south till after the holiday, I imagined. The dogs gave over to the rocking sway of the car and were soon snoring in the back while we watched the scenery go by, sometimes quiet with our own thoughts, and sometimes talking and laughing, remembering other years at the farm. The house stood well back from the road, with fields all around it and a long, faded red barn at its back. It had a wide front porch that my cousins and I had jumped from as children, and broad windowsills that I'd sat on to read books in the summers of my teenage years. The driveway was full of cars, and through the lit windows of the house, I could see our family, gathered in clumps, spread from the kitchen to the front room. The dogs flew out of the car when we opened the doors and went racing through the yard. They knew this place and loved to run till they couldn't run anymore. They'd eventually duck in through the doggy door in the back and find a friendly lap, or stretch a floor by the fire, or generous hand sneaking a treat under the kitchen table to cozy up to. We loaded our arms with our sacks and stepped up onto the porch to happily enter into the melee of a bustling family holiday. As we opened the old farmhouse door, we were met with embraces, jokes, our names being called from every corner of the room. We turned over our burdens and shed our coats. Little ones raced up to show us how much they'd grown, to tell us the name of their favorite teacher, or to grab our hands and show us the secret door in the back of the coat closet that, though it simply hid an old disconnected panel of fuses, in their minds, could possibly lead to Narnia. A cousin squeezed my hand and winked twice, a secret signal we'd used since we were both 8 years old, which meant hello, but evolved as we aged to mean something more like meet me on the back porch later for a good gossip and a glass of wine. Making my way through nieces and nephews, cousins and family friends who'd been adopted in years ago, I eventually got to the kitchen, where my aunt, keeper of the family treasures, wrapped her arms around me and squeezed my still cold fingers until they were warm. The kitchen counters were full of dishes, casseroles with spoons sticking out of them ready to feed the next hungry person to find their way in, salads made with dark greens and dried cherries and nuts, breads baked and brought just for today, and trays of cookies and sweets. My aunt looked at the two of us and said what must be the friendliest sentence anyone can ever speak. Sit down, and I'll fix you a plate." We scooted into some mismatched chairs, probably brought up from the basement as part of the youngest cousin's chores for that day, and space was made for us at the long wooden table, where various relatives were digging in or pushing back well-scraped plates, bouncing kids on their knees or arguing over the next day's menu. My aunt set down plates in front of us, and we grinned up at her. Having someone fix you a plate is always better than doing it yourself. They'll give you loving portions and cram every inch of the plate with what they know you like best. Even if I'd filled my plate the same way, it wouldn't have tasted as sweet. We pulled forks from an old coffee mug full of them at the center of the table, and we're happy to sit back and fill our stomachs and just listen to the overlapping conversations of all these people who knew us in a way that no one else did, in a way that family does. Later, there would be a walk out in the brisk air with the dogs, and then some pretty serious card games that would go until late, the rivalries of decades carried out hand after hand. The children, worn out from excitement, would fall asleep on sofas and be carried up to bed. And tomorrow, a group of us, the early risers, would be up before the sun to start coffee, flip pancakes, and divvy up the work of the big meal of the day. Someone would organize a nature walk or a treasure hunt for the kids. Someone would turn on old movies. Someone would nap all day on a couch. Together we'd be grateful, certainly for the big things, each other, food, health, this place, but also for the millions of little things that we were learning to pay more attention to as the years passed. The paw prints in the frost, the plate fixed for you, the quiet cup of coffee after it was all done and put away. At the parade. We'd been going since we were kids, bundled in our coats and hats, sleepy at first and then full of excitement as we got close to Main Street and felt the bustling energy of the crowd. And thinking back, the crowds couldn't have been much. Our village just doesn't have enough folks in it to pack the streets, but as a child, I felt like I was standing on Herald Square in New York City, about to watch Snoopy glide out from between the buildings. Some years we opted to stay in our pajamas and watch the big parade on TV, but most of the time we went, and we still go. This morning I'd woken early and crept downstairs in my slippers. The house was dark, and I left it that way, just turning on the light over the stove. I filled the kettle at the sink and looked into the yard, but couldn't make out a thing. I set the kettle on the stove and turned the dial, listening to the click of the lighting mechanism and the soft whoosh of the flame igniting. While I waited for it to boil, I slipped an overcoat from the hook by the door and stepped outside. The cold air opened my eyes, and I zipped up my coat to my nose. This had become my own private morning ritual lately. Set the water for tea, and then creep out and look for the spot where the sun was rising. At the end of our block, just 2 houses down, the road rose a bit, and from there, I could look down over the edge of the park. The darkness was less dark there, less dense. And as I stood with my arms wrapped around me, shifting the weight from foot to foot in the cold air, it began to turn purple and then pink. In another moment, the whole sky was changing, and the spaces around the houses and trees were becoming defined again. I liked to sneak back in before anyone else was on the street. This moment was just for me, so I only stayed another few breaths. I could see them in the air before me. Often when we think of things we are grateful for, we name the big things: health, home, family, friends. And certainly there's a reason that those are at the top of the list. But these small, private moments helped me remember the tiny details of my days that deserved appreciation. On that list were clean sheets, soft sweaters, toast and jam, hot showers, a love note in my lunchbox, 7 in the evening and 7 in the morning. I took one more breath of the chilled air and turned and happily shuffled back into the house. Inside it was still quiet, but a few lights had been switched on, and I found a mug waiting for me on the counter, the tea bag floating in the hot water. I smiled as I gently dunked it a few times, watching the dark color from the leaves swirl and spread. Add it to the list, I thought. Someone who knows your favorite tea and makes it for you while you stand outside and watch the sun come up. The parade was set for mid-morning, so after our tea we bundled up and walked into town. Lots of neighbors were heading out at the same time, and we called out to each other as we strolled. We cut through the park, and as we came out of the other side, we could hear the marching band warming up and the low buzz of folks talking and laughing. The cafe, the bakery, and the diner were all open, and some people preferred to watch from there, warm in a booth with breakfast in front of them. But as we'd be sitting down to a big meal in the afternoon, we liked to stay on our feet and watch from the curb. There were carts serving coffee and hot cider, bagels and donuts, and that was our first stop. We got a bag of cinnamon sugar donuts and 2 cups of strong black coffee. I stood and took a bite of the donut, sweet and spiced, then a long sip of the bitter coffee. It was the best combination, and I added it to my list of ordinary miracles. We walked, sipping and chewing, down from the park toward the theater. That was the best spot. That's where the parade would turn, coming down from the end of Park Street and on to Main. That's where the band would stop and play an extra song, flags waving and drummers tossing their sticks into the air and mostly catching them when they came back down. There was an open square with paving stones and benches and lampposts, already strung with twinkle lights for the upcoming holidays. We found a spot, and just in time. We could hear the band strike up from a few blocks away, and saw the first float coming down the street. We cheered, kids clapped and stomped their feet. I slipped the bag of donuts into my pocket so we could hold hands. Holding hands. Add it to the list. There were a few floats that came back every year. The hay cart from the Christmas tree farm, full of people in sweaters holding pumpkins in their laps, pulled by a big green tractor. The fire truck decked out with poinsettias and wreaths, and for some reason, a giant bathtub full of enormous plastic bubbles, pulled by a pickup truck. That last one had been in the parade since I was a kid, and it was a bit of a local favorite, though admittedly strange. A few years ago, when cousins were in town for Thanksgiving and had come to the parade with us, they'd cocked their heads confusedly as the tub went coasting down Main. "Why?" they'd asked. "I'm sure it made sense at the time," I yelled over the crowd. "But we don't know anymore," and we'd all laughed about it. As in any local parade, there were also cars full of people who seemed to be there for no reason, but they made up for it by throwing candy into the crowd, and we still clapped for them. The band turned the corner in front of us, and we cheered as they marched and played. We could see the end of the parade coming from a few blocks away. There was a float made by the high school drama club, who were putting on Clue for the winter play. The usual suspects all stood in costume, waving to the crowd and clutching the scenery as the trailer bumped along. There were kids in gymnastics outfits and coats who I think were meant to tumble on a mat spread in the square, but mostly just waved at their parents and wandered as their teachers attempt to herd them. Finally, with a swell of jingle bells, Santa, in a sleigh that sat the rest of the year in the center of the antique shop, came waving and calling around the corner. We laughed, caught in the contagious joy of the crowd and the children. We squeezed hands. If you are hearing this on the day it comes out, November 25th, then you are hearing this on my birthday. And I think sometimes about the opening line of the novel, The 13th Tale by Diane Setterfield, in which she says that all children mythologize their birth. I feel like I was born into the cozy season, settled right into one of the warmest, most loving days of the year. And that is woven into my cells to echo the feeling of gratitude, friendship, and gentle joy that I associate with November. Our first story tonight, Friendsgiving, was written in that first autumn of COVID times. And I was struggling to figure out how to write about things, like the upcoming holiday, in a way that felt connected to what we were all going through, but also not a big sad bummer. I never mentioned the pandemic in my stories, but I did try to find ways to gently acknowledge how listeners might be feeling, and this story is an example of that. That feeling that Thanksgiving was going to be different this year. And for lots of folks in any given year, traditions change. Family structures shift. Relationships, distance, circumstance can all throw a wrench into the usual plans, so I think it's still a relatable experience. These narrators have by now been in several other episodes, including Friendsgiving again, and the New Year's stories in episode 4 of this show called Over the Fence and Auld Lang Syne. They just got a new episode in the bedtime story feed that came out a week ago called Pies and Pine Cones, so go take a listen over there. The idea of a fence between two adjoining yards is something some of my good friends have. They are friends and their dogs are friends, so they just installed a gate and they can all go back and forth between yards. I loved it, and it inspired these characters. In our second story, Over the River and Through the Woods, which of course is a line from an old song about traveling to grandmother's house on Thanksgiving, we get that big family farmhouse experience, which I have to be honest, I have never had. My own Thanksgivings are much more about chosen family than extended family, but I love the idea of it. I've always been a little jealous of people who had close friendships with their cousins, that had a special aunt or uncle who they connected with. It just wasn't in the cards for my family to be that way, so enjoy it if you have it. I stand by the opinion that having someone fix you a plate is one of the most loving things that can happen to you. The friends we spend Thanksgiving with are excellent at this. No one's glass stays empty or their plate unfilled for a moment before more is offered and encouraged, and the food is delicious. I hope you have something really good to eat this year at Thanksgiving. The aunt in this story is the same narrator as the one in the stories Rosemary for Remembrance and Sugar Snow, the first of which you can hear in episode 42 and the latter in episode 13. In our last story, we head into downtown Nothing Much to see the parade. Now, I am firmly planted on my sofa on Thanksgiving morning with coffee and treats to watch the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade. And I'm not even willing to drive into nearby Detroit to watch their excellent parade. But I love the idea that these folks are getting up and seeing the village parade. My wife and I, however, are in our small town's 4th of July parade every year with a small brigade of mopeds and Vespas, and I always fall more in love with our own village when we do it. We decorate our bikes, and we buy so much candy and somehow still run out before the end of Main Street. And that float, the tub full of bubbles that no one remembers why it started, I feel like that is a classic small town thing. It wasn't based on anything in our parade, though our own town has a spot on the river, a sort of outdoor dive bar, which is called Red Dock. And get this, it's yellow. It has been yellow for as long as I can remember, and still it is called Red Dock, and no one questions it. And I wonder if there's something like that where you live. The idea of being grateful for small things echoes in a couple of these stories today. And it used to be a practice I would do with my yoga teacher trainees when I was a studio owner. We would set a timer for a minute or so and write down everything that we were grateful for. And then when it went off, we would restart it, and I'd ask them to write down everything they would be grateful for if they knew they would never have it again. And suddenly, they couldn't write fast enough. Suddenly, there are so many things that you realize feel good, are good, and would be desperately missed. I recommend it. All right, my friends. Thank you for spending my birthday with me. If you have a moment to rate and review this show, that would honestly be a very appreciated gift. I hope this week is full of warm embraces, fixed plates overflowing with your favorite food, and small wonders that make you smile.